University, which, to its shame, had offered succour to Wycliffe, and so there was a deep suspicion of anyone arriving here with unorthodox religious views. And still worse for Tyndale. Even if you studied theology, there was no requirement to do so directly from the scripture. And yet it was here that Tyndale found his destiny. While he was a student at Oxford, the great Dutch scholar Erasmus produced a remarkable edition of the New Testament. It consisted of the original Greek text with his Latin translation beside it. Erasmus translated it into Latin to achieve an international, if academic, audience. At last it was possible for Christians all over Europe to go back to the original words of the Gospels, to return to the world of the Apostles.
The Greek was completely unknown until Erasmus printed it. And this is a sensationally important printing. The New Testament is a Greek thing, and anything else is a translation. The impact of that on Tyndale was colossal.
It was a revelation, perhaps the most important in his life, and it gave him his vocation.
While he was at Magdalen, Tyndale read scripture privily to certain students and fellows. So I think he's reading the Greek New Testament translated by him to them. And I think the vocation happened on the arrival of Erasmus' New Testament.
Tyndale was not alone in his excitement. Right across Europe, Erasmus's text was a signal for religious eruptions. The most important was in Wittenberg in Germany, where a monk called Martin Luther had made a close study of the text of the New Testament, bringing him into bitter conflict with the church. To him, the power and wealth of the church were a disgraceful exploitation of the faithful. His rebellion began what today we call the Reformation. It divided Europe forever.
I don't think there's anything inevitable about what happened in the Reformation, but it was a struggle about something very profound indeed: how you are saved, how you get to heaven. And what Protestants said was what the Apostle Paul had said, that you and I can do nothing for our own salvation. It's all in the hands of God. Now that's Luther's message. The trouble was that the late medieval church had said to people, well, actually you can do things to be saved. There is a place called purgatory. You can stay there for a while. You can have prayers said for you, and these will help you get to heaven. That was what Luther objected to, the idea that you and I can do things. Luther wouldn't shut up when the Pope told him to, and that moment was what caused the split.
Across Europe, a new, more violent age was dawning. But in England at that time, the church was pretty adept at suppressing religious dissent. Tyndale knew that putting the Bible into English was both a difficult and dangerous job. For one thing, the new scholarship, with its emphasis on the original texts, made it a far more complex and intellectually demanding task. And then, actually printing a Bible was a far more public act than simply copying a manuscript. You could reach a lot more people that way, but you ran the perpetual risk of exposure. Remember, the English Bible was still illegal. But Tyndale was undeterred, and in 1522 he left Oxford and began work back home in his native Gloucestershire. Over in Germany, Luther's Reformation was gathering pace. That very autumn, he published his own German translation of the New Testament. It was an enormous success. Instead of being banned, it sold out in weeks, and Luther began to take his place in German history.
The Bible translation surely is the biggest thing Luther ever did. Imagine the influence Shakespeare had on the English language. Then you get an idea what Luther means for Germany. He had a great ear for the way people talk to each other. When the first edition of the New Testament appeared in 1522 in September, it was the huge amount of 3,000 copies, and they were sold out within 8 weeks.
In Gloucestershire, working ostensibly as a tutor to the children of a local grandee, Tyndale continued his translation in emulation of Luther. He thought he'd be safe. He was wrong. Although Lollards were not scarce, and there were like-minded souls in Gloucestershire, even here there was trouble. It had become a rather dangerous time to give voice to religious dissent. Overseas, Martin Luther had been excommunicated by the Pope. And King Henry VIII, or one of his palace spin doctors, had written a vituperative attack upon Luther's ideas. And now Tyndale wasn't merely illegally translating the Bible, he was also pushing unorthodox religious views from the pulpit.
He was largely preaching St. Paul, and the idea of personal faith, which came to him from Lollardy and also from his reading of the Greek New Testament, was against a great deal of what was being taught by the church.
Tyndale was called before the local bishop's court.
Tyndale wrote about it later, saying that the Chancellor rated me like a dog. But after all the shouting, nothing happened. It's very interesting.
Despite his powerful friends, Tyndale was now fatally compromised, but his determination was undimmed.
If God spare me ere many years, I will cause a boy that driveth the plough shall know more scripture than thou dost.
In Germany, Luther's protests had been supported by his local ruler. That had meant there were big changes to church life, with services in the native language and a Bible to match. It was clear now that Tyndale was going to get nowhere in England without official protection of this kind. So, having been driven out of his native Gloucestershire, Tyndale came to London for one last throw of the dice. For Tyndale, this was truly a vocation. It's all very well to translate the Bible. The point, however, was to spread it throughout the land so that everyone could get that sense of religious transformation. And to a degree, the politics and the doctrinal issues didn't impinge upon Tyndale at all. He was a pragmatist. If he could get one eminent churchman to wave the ban, to give him dispensation, then that would do. The man he chose was the Bishop of London. He lived right here next to St. Paul's Cathedral. His name was Cuthbert Tunstall. Tunstall was an intellectual, and he knew all the key figures in the new scholarship movement.
Tunstall was a good, clever man who knew his Greek, close friend of Erasmus.
Tyndale wrote to implore Tunstall to lift the ban.
They say our tongue is too rude. It is not so. Has not God made the English tongue as well as others?
Tyndale believed that if anyone would get the point, it would be Tunstall, and the letter, somewhat presumptuously, even suggested that Tunstall should take him into his household.
Tunstall was known as somebody who may be an enemy, but wasn't going to burn people.
But Tyndale's idea was what we might call politically inexpedient. Tunstall refused his application. For Tyndale now, the die was cast.
I understood at last, not only that there was no room in my Lord of London's palace to translate the New Testament, but also that there was no place to do it in all England.
It was in the spring of 1524 that Tyndale fled the country. His efforts to drum up support for translating the Bible into English had come to nothing. Friends and sympathizers might help tide him over, but no one was prepared to stick their necks out for him. In England, the Catholic establishment was seemingly winning its battle to prevent the publication of a Bible in the national tongue. But Tyndale was implacable. There just had to be a Bible for the ordinary men and women of England written in the English language. And if it meant he had to leave the country in order to bring this about, then so be it. He left, and Tyndall was never to see England again. But in exile, he would defy the authorities. His translation would rock the foundations of the English Church and change the country forever. In 1524, William Tyndale had fled from England to finish his translation of the Bible. He came to Germany. It was a country in spiritual and political turmoil. Here, in Wittenberg, Martin Luther's outburst against the Pope had ignited a religious revolt. Lutheran churches in Germany had introduced the kind of reforms which once Wycliffe had hoped for, and Tyndale now dreamed of. They had services in their own language instead of Latin, and read their own Bible, which was freely printed throughout the country. And they were able to do so because, using the power of printing, Luther's ideas had made huge inroads into papal authority. So the obvious place for Tyndale to have come was Wittenberg, but in fact, there's very little evidence to go on. You can search through the letters and journals of Martin Luther and his associates, and you won't find any mention of this rogue Englishman, William Tyndale. And Tyndale himself, of course, for understandable reasons, tended to be a bit secretive about where he was and what he was doing. But there's one tantalizing piece of evidence. The matriculation book of Wittenberg University still survives. Everyone who came here to study had to be registered and swear allegiance to the university rules and statutes. Now here's the book. If we look down a page under the entry for 1508, we find the name Father Martin Luther of Mansfeld, underlined in red. And then, 16 years later, there's something interesting. Guglielmus Dalton ex Angliae. William Dalton of England. Could that possibly be William Tyndale? Except he's changed around the last two syllables in order to put people off the scent. So, did Tyndale come to Wittenberg? We'll probably never know for sure, but certainly there's a sense in which Wittenberg came to Tyndale. This was the cradle of Lutheranism, and the ideas of religious freedom which spread throughout Germany strengthened Tyndale in his resolve that the same thing must happen in England.